Hello, everyone. Welcome to spring in Boston. Isn't it lovely out there? For anybody who had to come a distance this morning, congratulations to you. We are going to try to touch on some main points because we only have 20 minutes, and I don't want Danny to turn into a beast if we go over, as she said she might do if we don't follow time. So we're going to talk a little bit about the global picture of food and food security right now, some of the initiatives that are underway to help with that, some of the concerns, and hopefully we'll end on a little bit of hope of what we can do where the picture is dire. So, Ray, thank you so much. And I'm wondering if you could start by giving us a brief overview of the global food picture and global food security right now.
Great. Well, first of all, good morning, food activists here in Boston and around the world. And I just want to offer a big thank you to Food Tank, an organization that we're very proud to partner with here in Boston and also in the work we do in Washington. So big thanks to Danny and all the team from Food Tank. And also Tufts University, Dean Musavarian and Bill Master, who also are partners of ours here in Boston. So big thank you to our food fellows here in Boston that share these common interests. Just quickly, at a very high level, I think we're facing a number of big problems. In terms of the challenge of the future is we've got to build a sustainable global food system. And this is an issue, I think, that over the last 10 years, because of the work many people here in the room have done and many people around the world, I think there's a growing realization that the food system that is fossil fuel dependent, that is basically not reaching the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable populations around the world, that is subject to climate change, that is has been subject over the last decade or so to depleting food stocks, which have raised prices and created the 2008-9 food crisis. It's not sustainable. And moreover, I think one of the points I think the Dean was making earlier is there's been this crazy sort of disconnect between production priorities and nutrition policy. And this is something finally that the world is starting to talk about. How do we connect what we're producing with what it is we're eating, and how do we do that consciously with the goal of ensuring health? So I think that's the big project that I think all of us need to be committed to and engaged in over the coming years. And then I think in the short term, we're faced with a very big challenge, which is these 4 famines, simultaneous famines. This is an extraordinary moment. We have 20 million people around the world who are food insecure at the moment in the extreme.
Four. Where?
4 famines, Nigeria in the Boko Haram area, South Sudan, a country that's been in conflict now for, since really almost its birth, Yemen, and Somalia. Now, interestingly, 3 out of 4 of those famines are conflict related, and one of them is in a country, Somalia, which has had protracted conflict, but has also actually been subjected now to some climate-related impacts, a sustained drought. And those are 4 that we're hearing about now, but actually I was in Ethiopia not long ago, and one of the days I was there, the minister in charge of food and nutrition and agriculture in the country actually convened a meeting of all the major international not-for-profits in the country to basically say we're on the verge of a famine in eastern Ethiopia, and we're not even hearing about Ethiopia. And the same conversation is going on in Uganda and in even parts of northern Kenya. So actually, what we're going to see emerging now is not just a crisis in Somalia, but a crisis across the Horn of Africa to compound this issue and actually increase the numbers. So we're talking 20 million now, but we're going to be talking, I think, even more numbers sort of going forward. And for example, in Somalia, if they don't get rains in April, the numbers are going to explode. The wheat stocks are running out. So there's urgency to this famine problem that's extraordinary and historic, and something I think all of us as food activists need to be on top of, conscious of, and taking action on.
And that's the biggest issue, would you say, right now, those 4 famines?
I think those 4 famines are the big issue in the short term. I think if we want to talk the larger food system in terms of transitions, one of the things we discovered in 2008 when there was the food price crisis of 2008 was that major funders had disinvested in the agricultural sector. The World Bank back in the 1970s and 80s was investing 40% of its portfolio in agriculture. And USAID was investing roughly 40% of its funding in agriculture. When the food price crisis occurred in 2008-9, that investment was down to 4%. And this is investment in countries where 80% of the people are deriving their income from agriculture. So you have to ask, how did that happen? What was the disconnect? And part of what happened was we sold the world on the idea that there would be abundant surpluses always and cheap food on the international market, so you didn't need to invest in agriculture in your own country because you could always buy cheap food on the international market. So what happened? 2008-9, we woke up and the stocks were gone. Australia had a 7-year wheat drought, which had undermined their wheat stock. There was events in Russia that undermined wheat production there. A variety of other climate-related events were actually suppressing production, and underinvestment in the African nations that needed the food, but were relying on this free market concept of abundance in the global food market and abundant stocks. I think what happened at that point in time is that whole model kind of got blown up, and now we have to actually think more consciously about how are we going to feed the 9 billion by 2050? That's the core question that's, I think, obsessing many of us that are working on the global food system and thinking about food security on a global level.
Let's talk about initiatives, particularly in regard to the 4 famines. What do you do? I mean, what are some of the things that you think would be really helpful in this case?
Well, immediately we've got to get food to people that are in these distressed areas, and so first of all, we need the funding to do that. And there are a lot of our organizations that do frontline humanitarian work. We're there in those places. We're there with the United Nations. The UN has really been basically speaking out about the fact that these famines are real and they're getting worse, and we need to get food to people. And so immediately, the world, I think the most immediate need is to actually get governments to make commitments to the $4.4 billion appeal that's been put forward by the UN to deal with this famine, and not only actually respond to that appeal with pledges, because oftentimes governments say, oh, we're going to pledge $500 million, and then they don't actually disperse. The urgency of this is people are dying today. There's a child dying every 5 minutes in Africa in these famine-related areas right now. So if we don't get the money out and we don't get the food on the ground, and we don't get support to the frontline providers, we're going to see these numbers escalate. Now, interestingly, oftentimes in countries like Ethiopia, where you're having a famine, it's in eastern Ethiopia. There is food in other parts of Ethiopia. So one of the things that we've got to do is be smart about how we do this work. And so we can buy food in other parts of Ethiopia and get it to the eastern part of Ethiopia. We can do that really fast, but we need the money to buy it. We don't have to ship it from the United States on ships that are going to take a month and a half to get there. In that month and a half, you can imagine what the consequences are going to be. So I think the urgency for the moment is all of us who are interested in these issues, we've got to break through, I think, in the news cycle and make this an important story that the world cares about, number one. And I think all of you out there around the world who are food activists, pushing your governments to get behind support for famine relief is really critical. And enabling the UN and agencies to kind of get to the front line and push the media a bit to get this story a little bit higher in the queue, so that the world is seeing this as what it is. I've actually been around for quite a while, and there have been famines in my lifetime in Biafra, in Africa, in Nigeria, and also in Ethiopia. And what's striking to me right now is this is bigger than all of those, and yet we don't even hear about it. And so I just want to underline the urgency of us to kind of get the message out, break through with some passion on the importance of this, and push politicians and the political systems to actually deliver value and money to those who need it.
You mentioned also the initiative by the United Nations, but I'm wondering, where do things stand under the new administration in the U.S. White House, and what do we know about that in terms of getting relief and humanitarian aid to these places?
Well, the new administration, as some of you may have heard, initially rolled out its, sort of a trial balloon budget and suggested it was going to cut, U.S. foreign aid by 40%. And that is a draconian figure by any standard, and would actually undermine a lot of the programs that had been ongoing that were actually making a difference in this area. Important to recognize that after the food price crisis in 2008 and 9, the Obama administration took action. It took action to actually rally the world. In Washington, Obama had a food summit similar to this with world leaders present in the G7, G8. And actually the idea was we've got to reinvest in agriculture. So we upped our budget in the agricultural sector through Obama's Feed the Future program, which was he put $3 billion on the table right away to get that launched. It's made a difference in a number of countries in reducing hunger and poverty in a variety of different countries. Demonstrably, there's evidence to prove that. So the question, I think, is whether this new president and the new budget that he will present is actually going to continue, one, AID in some meaningful form, whether it's going to continue for food aid assistance. One of the things that was in the budget, proposed budget, was cutting a lunch program for children around the world that annually was funded at about $200 million. This was actually a bipartisan, just to go back to the dean's point about food should be a bipartisan issue. This was actually created under the end of the Clinton administration. It was called the McGovern-Dole program. And so we had two former presidential candidates actually supporting this, putting their name on it, and it's been actually saving lives and making a difference for children for some time. That's on the chopping block, and it actually was there, in the budget presentation. It's not clear to us yet how the humanitarian funding itself for food and for famines would actually be affected. The good news here, and I want to underline this, is there are some strong internationalists in Congress on the Republican side of the aisle, and the difference maker in this budget is going to be who are those Republicans that are going to line up and support the continuation of U.S. foreign assistance and intelligent and smart U.S. foreign assistance that actually will be making a difference in the world on food and a variety of other issues, health and education as well, and particularly in these humanitarian, and particularly support for humanitarian crises.
And there's a new AID director.
And we heard just yesterday that Mark Green, a former ambassador who under one of the Bush administrations was named as the candidate for the USAID position. And actually, for those of us in the field, actually that's good news. We've worked with Mark in the past on these issues as part of sort of working groups in Washington on aid and development. So at a time when there's a lot of bad news, I think Mark's naming an potential appointment, he's got to go through the congressional hearing process, is, I think, good news for those of us who care about foreign aid going forward.
So do you think then that it's more optimistic than maybe it first appeared?
Well, I think if we're watching Washington at the moment, there are 4 or 5 different versions of what the policy of this administration will be. So one of the hard things to figure out is actually what version of that will actually become truth and fact. And so I think what we've got to be all be vigilant about, our continued and persistent support for a positive vision on investment in agriculture, and investment in nutrition, and investment in humanitarian support for famines and famine relief and humanitarianism more generally as kind of core high principle values that the United States has always represented and the American people really care about. And at Oxfam, we do a lot of focus group work around the United States. And one of the things we always find is even before those of us who have gotten passionate about food and food justice, the American public at the citizen level has always responded to famines and has always responded on hunger issues. And so there's a deep reservoir of sympathy for these issues. I just think those of us who care about it have to get out there and make it a priority in the public domain.
What else do you think an average consumer might be able to do in a situation like this to help with, global food security going into the future?
Well, I guess what I'm excited about is the work that groups like Food Tank are doing and others that have actually put this issue at the center of the agenda globally. And I've been working in this field for 40 years, going all the way back to the Green Revolution in the 70s, which was probably something that many of you in the audience were not even born yet, was taking place in an effort to kind of increase food productivity. And we've never had, I think, the attention in the United States of citizenry in very different kinds of ways to the food issue. I mean, we have chefs that are active, we have mothers that are active, we have agricultural groups of all varieties that are active, trying to think through sustainability and what sustainability will mean in agriculture. So I'm optimistic that the coming together of all of this energy and all of these groups is just terrific for this issue. And that's why myself and all of my colleagues at Oxfam are very excited to be associated with these efforts, and because we think we need political power to drive the positive agendas for the future. And so all of your attention, your presence, and your voice is really critical. So I do think citizens matter, and I think the interesting thing is, our old Boston politician, coined the phrase that all politics is local. One of the things Tip O'Neill, thank you. He was fond of reminding us that all politics is local. In Oxfam, we've learned that also. And so we actually spend a lot of time going to the offices of our representatives in their home districts as a group. Because when you do that, actually, let the legislators think, well, if there's smoke, there may be a fire. There may not be a fire, but you may be representing the potential of one. And that actually gets the legislators' attention. In Washington, it's oftentimes hard to get to the legislators. They're distracted. But if they think there's something going on in their home district that actually could result in them not getting reelected, they pay attention. So I think one of the most important things those of us who are in the food activist community can be doing is actually getting to our legislators in their home districts with some strong messages about food justice and sustainability and pushing those questions.
When you mention AID and its crucial role in all of this, there was a time when Oxfam was critical. Can you remind us of what's changed there?
Well, one of the big changes was we were critical in the first instance because we felt they were underinvesting in agriculture. And that was not just AID, that was actually a lot of the funders in Europe as well and the World Bank. And so there was a wake-up call, and we were part of pushing that. And a lot of the food activist community was critical in enabling that to happen. But I think also, one of the things that we were able to accomplish legislatively that was actually originated during the Bush administration and was continued under Obama was the notion that we needed to reform our food aid program. And many of you may not know this, but our food aid program, the United States government has historically contributed 50% of the food that feeds people around the world in crisis and emergency situations on an annual basis. 50% of the food that goes through the World Food Program budgets and distribution systems. But the paradox in that was that when we set that program up, there were several requirements that were kind of somewhat onerous and problematic. One was that had to be shipped on U.S. flag carriers, U.S. shippers. It had to be milled by U.S. millers, and the large majority of the food had to be purchased in the U.S. and then shipped. Now, that was all very good, and it made sense for a while. But then what we began to realize was that 50 cents on every dollar of money of taxpayer money that was being spent for that was actually was going to the shippers and the millers and the farmers in the United States, not to the people that needed the food on the ground. So Andrew Natsios, actually formerly here of Boston, actually originated this idea of what we call local purchase. The idea that there is food available in neighboring countries or even in the same country. Why don't we buy locally, get the food there fast, and we'll actually get it there cheaper? So the proposal was, what if we spent 25% of the cash budget to do that, and we'll save more lives, we'll do it quicker, and the taxpayer gets benefit because we'll get more bang for the buck. Well, amusingly, the lobbies from the shippers and the millers and on resisted this over three administrations. Two administrations, and we finally, at the end of the Obama administration, got reform in this area. So now actually we are able to or AID is able to purchase significant amount of food locally to actually get food to emergencies quicker, while we retain some portion of that budget that actually goes for purchasing domestically and shipping. But we've seen cases in the past where by the time the ship gets out of the Great Lakes, up St. Lawrence, across the ocean, around to Eastern Africa, we've lost many, many, many lives. And our view was that was not a good way to do business. And so that's, I think, some progress in the way the American system has actually evolved over the last decade or so.
How does the U.S. compare with other countries in terms of dealing with some of these issues?
Well, as I said, in terms of just general scale of our contribution, we have been the most generous in the world in terms of, particularly in the food area. In terms of our aid budget, interestingly, when the American public is asked what our aid budget is, they will generally say it's 15% of our budget for foreign aid. Historically, it's actually been something like 1/10 of 1%. So it's, those of us who are in the aid community have been pushing to get it. There's an agreement among the aid providers to get it to 0.7 of 1%. And Great Britain and Denmark and some of the European countries have actually gotten there. We've never gotten close. And in the industrialized countries, we're something like 22 in terms of a percent of our annual budget that goes to foreign assistance. While our number in aggregate is the biggest, our percentage contribution in terms of our potential to contribute is actually number 22 or something like that, somewhere below Athens or below Greece or Czechoslovakia or something like that. So it's somewhat, we've challenged our government to get to up its game in that area. But so it's even more ironic now that we have a government that's doesn't even know how low that percentage is and wants to cut it even further. So again, not only the food issue could require some work politically, but I think also the broader aid system. It's not perfect, but I think there's improvements we could make, and Oxfam's been a part of the whole discussion about aid effectiveness. But protecting the money and doing it smarter, I think, is a challenge we should embrace.
Okay, I think we are out of time, unfortunately. Last message to folks here. Keep up the work.
Yes, I mean, I think, again, those of you who are part of the Food Tank Network, spread the word. I think use the social media platforms that we have. A lot of us are active on that. If you want to, for a lot of substantive richness, you can come to the Oxfam website at www.oxfamamerica.org, and there'll be a lot of information about the famine situation on an ongoing basis, and then a lot of rich research work that we've done on agriculture and agricultural issues around the world that will complement that. And also, Tufts University, I think, has some richness on their website, too, on agriculture and nutrition issues that you should also, I think, take advantage of.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, so let's take 2 questions from the audience.
Okay, 2 questions. Yes.
Mr. Offenheiser, I'm Peter. I'm a farmer from the Midwest. I'm a family farmer, conventional family farmer, raises corn and soybeans. And I've been an advocate for farmers and better food systems for many, many years, involved in the policy fight and debate in Washington. You mentioned a food price crisis of the late 2000s. I understand that. We went through that. We had high prices, commodity prices those years for only a few years, which was a rare occurrence in my history of farming, which most of the time is the cost of production or below.
So what's your question? I'm sorry to interrupt.
My question is, since farmers are facing a food price crisis in mid-America, in corn, soybeans, and wheat, that corn prices, wheat prices, soybean prices are all priced below the cost of production, and there's significant surpluses globally of all those commodities right now.
Right.
Is there any discussion in Washington about a food reserve, a commodity reserve, to save up some of these commodities and hold them back while in time, so when we deal with the next drought, we have something to fall back on and don't end up in another food price crisis.
Okay. Help for Midwest
Yeah.
farmers.
Well, no, the reserve question is a really good one, actually, and not only here domestically, but internationally. And so one of the things, at Oxfam, we actually have promoted the idea that would make sense. But interestingly, in this whole world in which free market thinking is actually dominant, there's been a kind of almost a school of thought that no, we shouldn't do that. We should just let the market, provide. And we were sort of gambling that we would always have those high surpluses and low prices for producers indefinitely. But I actually think, for example, in places that are going to be affected by drought, much of sub-Saharan Africa, where when the food price crisis hit, it not only hit them on food, there was also a price spike in oil. So the countries were depleting not only their food supplies, but also their treasuries, because they were paying for oil for transporting the food internally. They were paying higher prices for agricultural inputs that had petroleum components to them. So the whole system was just rattling. So I think this question about volatility, market volatility globally in the system, is one that we've got to tackle. And I think really once the market folks basically said, just wait another year or two and supplies will come back and the market will correct and we'll fix the problem, without actually looking at the structural issues underlying the crisis that actually required some really serious thinking and serious fixes of the sort you're describing. So we actually are supportive of that idea, but we find we run right into the free market sort of ideologues who basically are resistant to it, and who are willing to live with volatility. Because actually, when there is volatility, there are people who take advantage and win from volatility. There are people who bet against the stock market when it crashed and actually made lots of money. So volatility benefits people, even while it harms a lot of other people, and it usually harms the most vulnerable in most cases. So I'm in some ways with you on that one. We've got to think about how to flatten out the supplies and have assurance of global supplies that are going to meet demand. But we've also got to increase productivity for that $9 billion by 2050. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area as well.
Okay, only one question, I think.
Yeah, I
So we
lied.
have
I'm
time
very
for
sorry.
we'll go over schedule, but thank you again. Good question.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Fantastic.
Take care, huh? Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You're fantastic.